Good morning. Can you hear me okay? To increase the accessibility of my presentation, I've now posted it to Biopolitical Philosophy, the philosophy blog that I co-coordinate. So if you have a cell phone, a laptop, a tablet, or some other device with you, and you'd like to read along as I present, simply type Biopolitical Philosophy into your internet browser and click on the link to the blog. My presentation entitled Situating Disabled Philosophers and Philosophy of Disability in Philosophy is posted at the top of the blog. To get to my presentation, simply click on the title of the post. Again, if you want to read along with me, type Biopolitical Philosophy into your device's browser, follow the link to the blog, and click on the title of the post. Before I begin, I would like to publicly convey my enormous gratitude to Melissa Stain for generously inviting me to speak at this exciting event. I feel both honored and humbled to be amongst such an outstanding group of people. I would also like to thank Faith Lazarus, who made my travel and accommodation arrangements, Kutse Van Yarrow, who addressed some of my questions and concerns, Elva Boyce, Andiswa Gabash, and Nicoline who have provided sign language interpretation throughout the conference, and William Mofu for the kind introduction and for chairing this session. This is my first time in South Africa, and I've been thrilled to receive such a warm welcome and to learn more about the work of South African critical disability theorists and other critical thinkers from India, Nigeria, Portugal, and elsewhere. I hope that this conference marks the beginning of many more discussions amongst us. Situating Disabled Philosophers and Philosophy of Disability in Philosophy. Section 1. Disability in the Context of Philosophy. I am a philosopher by training. I did my graduate degrees in philosophy and wrote my PhD dissertation on disability and social justice in a philosophy department in Canada. Since graduation, I've done community organizing around disability and accessibility, conducted policy research on disability and human rights, and have continued to produce critical philosophical work on disability. In academic contexts, I have sought to raise the disciplinary profile of critical philosophical work on disability by introducing and promoting the growth of a new subfield of philosophy, namely philosophy of disability, and an extension of this subfield, namely feminist philosophy of disability. Through research, service, and professional activism, furthermore, I have sought to elevate the status of disabled philosophers, including with my publications and presentations at conferences, on social media, and on Biopolitical Philosophy, the philosophy blog that I coordinate with Melinda Hull, another disabled feminist philosopher of disability. The book that I published in late 2017, Foucault and Feminist Philosophy of Disability, is an outcome of my research, service, and activist endeavors in philosophy. The impetus to write the book derived from a combination of the following: the dismal career opportunities and prospects available to disabled philosophers, the marginalization of critical philosophical work on disability, the indifference of non-disabled philosophers to the pernicious ways that disabled people are represented in philosophical discourse, and the inertia of philosophers and philosophy associations about the distinct forms of institutionalized bias, hostility, and exclusion that disabled philosophers confront in philosophy. In my presentation today, I will provide an account of the marginalization of critical work on disability in the discipline of philosophy, indicate how disabled people are constituted in philosophical discourse as a problem to be rectified and ideally eliminated, and explain some of the other elements that produce the dire exclusion of disabled philosophers from the profession of philosophy. I will also indicate why I have drawn upon the work of disabled philosopher Michel Foucault to investigate these egregious states of affairs. I want to begin by broadly contextualizing my claims for the benefit of delegates at this conference who may be unfamiliar with the systemic inequalities and injustices that structure the discipline and profession of philosophy, conditioning the philosophical arguments and positions that philosophers learn as philosophy students and subsequently reproduce as philosophy faculty. Philosophy is the most conservative and homogeneous discipline across the humanities and social sciences with respect to areas of inquiry and specialization. As South African philosopher Leonard Preg puts it, and I quote, "Of all the disciplines in the humanities, philosophy is often regarded as the most resistant to change, transformation, and decolonization," end quote. Although mainstream philosophy prides itself on its appeals to the putative ideals of neutrality, universality, and objectivity, the institutionalized structure of the discipline implicitly and explicitly promotes certain situated ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies as bona fide philosophy, while other situated ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies are cast as offshoots of these allegedly fundamental ways of knowing and doing philosophy, and hence are regarded as more or less expendable. The homogeneity of the topics and questions studied in philosophy is co-constitutive with and reinforces the homogeneity of the demographics of philosophy. That is, philosophy is also the most demographically homogeneous discipline in the humanities and social sciences. Indeed, the profession of philosophy is populated almost exclusively by non-disabled white people, the majority of whom are men. Disabled philosophers make up about 1% of full-time philosophy faculty in Canada, and only marginally better in the United States, although by most credible estimates, disabled people constitute about 25% of the general population of North America. Black philosophers also comprise about 1% of full-time philosophy faculty in the US, although African Americans comprise approximately 15% of the US population. There are only 6 Black philosophers employed as full-time philosophy faculty in the United Kingdom, the entire United Kingdom. At present, there's not a single disabled philosopher of disability employed full-time in the Canadian philosophy department. I don't know how many disabled philosophers are employed as full-time faculty in South African philosophy departments. However, I do know that philosophy students and faculty were quite involved in the Must Fall movement and continue to protest the lack of diversity and representation in South African philosophy departments and South African philosophy associations, aiming to decolonize the discipline and profession of philosophy in South Africa and internationally. In the bibliography that follows the text of my presentation online, I provide links to blog posts that I've written about reports of this activism and the struggles in South African philosophy more generally. Given these reports about the racial and gender homogeneity of philosophy in South Africa, I presume that the number of disabled philosophers employed on a full-time basis in philosophy departments here is quite low. In addition to our lack of access to the economic benefits, institutional resources, medical and dental coverage, and other benefits that full-time employment in philosophy provides, disabled philosophers are largely excluded from publication in the leading philosophy journals, from philosophy conferences and workshops, informal professional networks, philosophy websites, blogs, and podcasts, funded research projects, leadership positions in professional philosophy associations, prizes, grants, awards, and fellowships, endowed research chairs, advisory boards, editorial boards, and so on and so forth. Over the past several decades, and in the last several years especially, marginalized philosophers have, as I've noted, steadily challenged the white heteronormative androcentrism of philosophy, persistently working to forge a new agenda for the discipline. For example, a number of feminist philosophy journals and societies have been created. Summer schools and institutes have proliferated that provide mentoring and other support to Black undergraduate philosophy students, LGBTQ philosophy undergraduates, and working class undergraduate philosophy students, among others. Professional philosophy associations increasingly fund projects that advance the interests of marginalized philosophy faculty, and more philosophy conferences prioritize the contributions of underrepresented groups in philosophy and spotlight underrepresented areas of philosophical research and teaching. Nevertheless, disabled philosophers and philosophy of disability tend to be systematically left out of many of these initiatives or haphazardly added to them, based on assumptions about diversity that take gender and race understood in isolation from each other to be paradigmatic categories of identity and subjection, obscuring the distinct forms of exclusion that disabled philosophers encounter, regardless of how they are gendered and racialized. I wanted to write a book that would at least document this terrible situation and its structural supports and material effects, if not produce a book that will provoke change to ameliorate the situation. Section 2, Disability and the Architecture of Philosophy. Within the tradition of Western philosophy, the subfields of metaphysics, value theory, logic, epistemology, and philosophy of language have been regarded as foundational to philosophical inquiry, uniquely distinguishing philosophy from other disciplines of research and teaching. Philosophers who hold this traditional, conventional view of the discipline maintain that these subfields, and only these subfields, are the necessary, unchanging, and so-called core elements of philosophy. Philosophers who conceive of philosophy in this way assume, furthermore, that other, more recent areas of philosophical inquiry, such as philosophy of race and feminist philosophy, are merely applications or contingent derivatives of these so-called foundational subfields. It is this conventional representation of philosophy that provides the scaffolding for Philpapers, the increasingly influential database of philosophical research. Philosophers go to the Philpapers database to access journal articles and other publications, to gauge the popularity of a given publication, to demonstrate their own interest in certain publications through views and downloads, and to otherwise stay abreast of recent developments in philosophy. In other words, Philpapers is a sort of academia edu, designed specifically for philosophers and philosophical research. Unlike academia edu, however, the content of the Philpapers database is organized into a limited number of predetermined areas of specialization, subfields, and topics in philosophy that are hierarchically arranged according to prevailing ideas in Eurocentric Western philosophy about which areas, subfields, and topics have the most philosophical import, have the most explanatory power, and should be endowed with the most authoritative status. Within the Philpapers database, critical philosophical work on disability is primarily relegated under applied ethics, a subcategory of the supreme category of value theory, and is largely medicalized and individualized. For example, subcategories related to disability can be found under biomedical ethics, a subcategory of applied ethics, alongside and on par with topics such as drugs, death and dying, and neuroethics, as well as under social ethics, another subcategory of applied ethics, alongside and on par with topics such as deception and friendship. This almost exclusive medicalized and individualized categorization of disability under the rubric of value theory circumscribes critical philosophical work on disability too narrowly, obscuring the fact that the phenomena of disability variously raise questions about its metaphysical and epistemological status, questions that philosophers of language consider, questions about the history of philosophy, and so on. As I've argued in other contexts, furthermore, the ways in which disability is categorized in the PhilPapers database discourages intersectional feminist analyses of its phenomena. I won't elaborate the previous claim in this portion of my presentation, but I'm happy to do so in our discussion. It would be difficult to overstate the constraining effects that the PhilPapers database generates for the development of critical philosophical work on disability. Nor could one overstate the deleterious consequences that accrue to disabled philosophers due to the structure of a spin-off of PhilPapers, namely PhilJobs, the leading international philosophy job board, whose architecture mirrors the framework of PhilPapers. To make a long story short, the structure of PhilJobs, like the structure of PhilPapers, systematically precludes adequate reference to philosophy of disability, discouraging the creation of job postings in philosophy of disability and preventing the specification of database searches for jobs in the area. Indeed, to date, no advertisement for a full-time philosophy job anywhere in the world has designated philosophy of disability as an area of specialization, despite the fact that research and teaching in philosophy of disability has been done for decades, and even though philosophy of disability's allies, that is critical disability theory and disability studies, are burgeoning interdisciplinary fields of inquiry elsewhere across the university. At present, philosophy job seekers who specialize in philosophy of disability must represent their work in medicalized terms, that is, as a form of bioethics, in order to be regarded as serious candidates for positions in philosophy. In other contexts, I have argued that bioethics is first and foremost a technology of modern government whose biopolitical aim is normalization of the population. My argument in this context is thus that insofar as philosophers of disability must package their work as bioethics, leaving the fundamentally pernicious nature of the enterprise of bioethics intact, philosophy of disability and philosophers of disability are effectively put in the service of a form of neo-eugenics. Let me underscore that the invalidation of philosophy of disability is enabled by the constitutive character of the individualized and medicalized classifications of disability that both these databases reproduce. Classification of subfields in philosophy and the questions and concerns that these subfields comprise are not merely value-neutral representations of objective differences, relations, and similarities that await discovery and recognition. Rather, classification and classification systems in philosophy, as elsewhere, are performative. They contribute to the constitution of the value-laden resemblances, distinctions, and relationships between phenomena and states of affairs that they put into place. Job postings in philosophy influence what philosophers regard as current and emerging research in the discipline and as important areas of the field to develop in their own departments. Hiring departments, insofar as they do not see other departments recruit and hire specialists in the subfield of philosophy of disability, are not motivated to recruit and hire specialists in philosophy of disability themselves. Given that many, if not most, specialists in philosophy of disability are themselves disabled, the current classificatory scheme of PhilPapers and PhilJobs ought to be recognized as a technology of power that contributes significantly to the underrepresentation of disabled philosophers in the profession of philosophy. In short, PhilPapers and PhilJobs reproduce and sustain the status quo in philosophy with respect to disability, and I want to point out other marginalized areas of specialization, such as indigenous philosophies and trans philosophy. Most philosophers believe that disability is a prediscursive and politically neutral human characteristic, a natural disadvantage, and personal misfortune that is appropriately addressed in the domains of medicine, science, and bioethics, rather than social and political philosophy and critical theory. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, a job posting appeared on PhilJobs with a specialization in bioethics and so-called mental disorders. As far as I know, no non-disabled philosopher has formally contested the naturalization of ableism and disability that conditions this job posting, nor has any non-disabled philosopher lodged a formal complaint with the PhilPapers Foundation about the way that the posting infringes the Foundation's anti-discrimination policy and code of conduct, as well as the anti-discrimination policy and code of conduct of the American Philosophical Association, which, as the largest professional philosophy association in the world, provides substantial funding and other resources to the PhilPapers Foundation. In my work, I have aimed to show that the prevalence in philosophy of this kind of individualized and medicalized understanding of disability, according to which disabled people are naturally flawed, is inextricably entwined with the exclusion of disabled philosophers, especially disabled philosophers of disability, from permanent employment in philosophy. Although the formula of PhilPapers and PhilJobs promotes the idea that both philosophy and classification of subfields in philosophy are value-neutral, disinterested, and impartial enterprises, political, social, economic, cultural, and institutional force relations influence every aspect of the discipline and profession of philosophy. Every philosophical question and concern, as well as every philosophical subfield that these questions and concerns comprise, is a politically potent artifact of historically contingent and culturally specific discourse. As discursive artifacts, furthermore, every philosophical question and concern, as well as every subfield that these questions and concerns comprise, has a history that can be traced genealogically. The underrepresentation of disabled philosophers in full-time faculty positions in philosophy is, of course, also due to the institutionalized biases and structural inaccessibility that disabled people in general confront in academia. Many disabled students, regardless of the discipline in which they major, feel compelled to leave school before the completion of a graduate degree due to the structural barriers, institutional discrimination, epistemic injustice, and personal prejudice that they encounter. The escalating incidence of student suicide on campuses throughout North America, and perhaps here too, is itself testament to the systemic inadequacy of supports for students positioned outside the norms, expectations, and demands of the neoliberal university. Nevertheless, I maintain that certain metaphysical and epistemological assumptions, specific disciplinary approaches, and distinct professional agendas, interests, and norms render philosophy especially hostile to both disabled people and critical analyses of disability. The prevalent assumption in philosophy that disability is a disadvantageous personal characteristic or property properly studied in biomedical contexts, the life sciences, and related fields is the crux of the problem, a problem that neoliberalism has produced through what Foucault called biopower, which is a vast network of forms of coercion and population control that target the life of the human being qua living being. That is, the life of the human being insofar as it is a living being. Indeed, as I've indicated, the assumptions that disabled people are naturally flawed and that disability should be addressed in the domains of medicine, the life sciences, and related fields has shaped philosophy, influencing course curricula, dictating authoritative areas of specialization in the discipline, reproducing conference lineups, conditioning the composition of philosophy departments and professional networks, fashioning the contents of philosophy journals, and so on and so forth. That the subfield of bioethics is financially lucrative for modern philosophy departments and for the neoliberal university more broadly, goes considerable distance to ensure the endurance of the medicalized and individualized understandings of disability that prevail in philosophy. Section 3, Philosophy of Disability. Philosophers of disability critically assess assumptions about disability that philosophical claims presuppose and identify the ways in which disabled people have been either vilified within the discipline of philosophy or exiled from it altogether. Philosophers of disability also advance accounts of disability that resist and run counter to the dominant conception of disability that persists within bioethics, cognitive science, and mainstream political philosophy and ethics, according to which disability is a natural disadvantage that necessarily reduces the quality and worth of disabled people's lives, inevitably leading to the social and economic disadvantages that accrue to disabled people. Insofar as practitioners of the Western philosophical tradition have, with few exceptions, cast disability as a natural, negative, and inert state of affairs in this way, they have effectively precluded disability from the realm of most philosophical inquiry. By contrast, philosophers of disability variously use and take a critical stance toward the history and contemporary practice of philosophy in order to articulate alternative ways in which to think philosophically about disability and about the current social, political, cultural, and economic position of disabled people. It seems to me, nevertheless, that philosophers of disability, the vast majority of whom are white, too willingly accept the importance conferred upon the conceptual frameworks, theoretical questions, policy concerns, and general philosophical approaches that the philosophers whose positions they ostensibly write against have put into place, and thus remain too obediently preoccupied with these conceptions, questions, concerns, and philosophical approaches. Philosophical approaches that comprise what Craig refers to as the Holy Trinity of Western philosophy, namely deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. Hence, examination of the metaphysical and epistemological status of disability has been largely neglected. Naturalization of disability in philosophy is expanding in new directions. The historical emergence and contingency of disability have remained obscured. The constitutive forms of power that Foucault identified have been disregarded. The constitutive forms of power that Foucault identified have been disregarded by most philosophers of disability, and the ways that disability is intertwined with, for example, settler colonialism, the climate crisis, white supremacy, class, and the exploitation and slaughter of non-human animals have been almost entirely ignored. I think that philosophy of disability should prod philosophers out of their complacency with respect to disability. In addition, I think that philosophy of disability should undermine the intransigent belief that most philosophers hold, according to which disability is fundamentally natural, rather than entirely artifactual. And furthermore, that philosophy of disability should offer a new way in which to understand disability in political terms, an understanding that takes account of disability's production and collusion by, through, and with racialized, gendered, and otherwise stratified and stratifying forms of social power. Indeed, I aim to subvert the conceptions of disability that prevail in philosophy and disability studies by arguing that disability is an apparatus in Foucault's sense. Foucault introduced the term apparatus to refer to a heterogeneous and interconnected ensemble of discourses, institutions, scientific statements, administrative measures, and philosophical propositions that responds to an urgent need in a given historical moment. As an apparatus, disability is a historically specific and dispersed system of power that produces and configures practices towards certain strategic and political ends. To understand disability as an apparatus is to conceive of it as a historically contingent matrix of power that contributes to, is inseparable from, and reinforces other apparatuses of force relations. including settler colonialism, gender, and class. As a historically contingent matrix of power, furthermore, the apparatus of disability comprises and is constituted by and through a complex set of technologies, identities, institutions, and discursive practices that emerge from medical and scientific research, government policies and administrative decisions, academic initiatives, art and literature, popular culture, and so on. Section 4, Denaturalizing Disability. Much of my writing, teaching, service, and activism in philosophy is designed to undermine a cluster of assumptions about the relation between nature and nurture. That is, a cluster of assumptions about the relation between biology and society, assumptions that naturalize disability, gender, race, and other apparatuses of power. I agree with African-American feminist sociologist and legal scholar Dorothy Roberts, who argues that there is no natural body, that all of life is at once biological and social, that genes do not determine anything, and that our brains are plastic, with the ability to be modified by social experience. As Roberts points out, biology is not a separate entity that interacts with the environment. Rather, biology is constituted through these social interactions. In her social constructionist anti-essentialism, Roberts argues against biosocial science that locates the origins of social inequalities in inherent traits rather than in post-social structures. She also argues against biosocial science that intervenes to fix perceived biological deficits in the bodies of oppressed peoples themselves rather than end the structural violence that dehumanizes them and maintains an unjust social order. In Foucault feminist philosophy of disability, I argue that critical analyses of the naturalization of social inequalities must consider how claims about the social construction of biological phenomena are produced, in what context these allegedly prediscursive phenomena are mobilized, and for what political purposes. Indeed, my work to articulate a feminist philosophy of disability that construes disability as an apparatus of power denaturalizes and debiologizes the phenomena of disability in these and other ways, using Roberts, Foucault, and other thinkers in order to do so. For example, I use Foucault's idea of apparatus to shift philosophical discussion about disability away from restrictive conceptualizations of it as a personal characteristic or attribute, a property of given individuals, an identity, or a biological difference. That is, my assumption that disability is an apparatus of productive power moves philosophical discussion of disability toward a more flexible conceptualization of it than other conceptions of disability provide, toward a conception of disability that is historically and culturally sensitive in ways that other conceptions of disability are not. Disability is not a metaphysical substrate, a natural biological category, or a characteristic that only certain individuals embody or possess, but rather is a historically contingent network of force relations in which everyone is implicated and entangled, and in relation to which everyone occupies a position. In other words, to be disabled or non-disabled is to occupy a certain subject position within the productive constraints of the apparatus of disability. There are no people with disabilities and able-bodied people. Rather, there are disabled people and non-disabled people. On my anti-foundational social constructionist approach, people are variously racialized through strategies and mechanisms of the apparatus of race, but no one has a race or even a particular race. On my approach, furthermore, people are variously sexed through strategies and mechanisms of the apparatus of sex, but no one has a sex or even a certain sex. So too, people are variously disabled or not disabled through the operations of the apparatus of disability, but no one has a disability or even a given disability. Disability, like race and binary sex, is not a non-accidental attribute, characteristic, or property of individuals, not a natural biological kind. that females and people of color, which are by no means mutually exclusive social groups, have been perceived as the bearers of sex and race respectively, doesn't mean that males are not also sexed in accordance with the apparatus of sex, nor does it mean that white people are not racialized in the terms of the apparatus of race. Likewise, that one is not subjected as a disabled person doesn't indicate that one occupies a space apart from the apparatus of disability. The apparatus of disability is expansive and expanding, differentially subjecting an increasing number of people to relatively recent forms of power based on constructed perceptions and interpretations of, among other things, bodily structure, appearance, style and pace of motility, mode of communication, size, emotional expression, mode of food intake, and cognitive character, all of which phenomena are produced and understood within a culturally and historically contingent frame and shaped by place of birth, place of residence, racialization, gender, education, religion, years lived, and so on. I contend furthermore that key classificatory schemes and distinctions currently made in philosophy of disability and disability theory are technologies of disabling relations of power, including the distinctions between visible disabilities and invisible disabilities, physical disability versus cognitive disability, physical impairments as opposed to sensory impairments, severe disabilities versus moderate or mild disabilities, and high functioning as opposed to low functioning. Although many disabled people reify these historically contingent products of the apparatus of disability, incorporating them into their sets of beliefs, theories, values, and practices, and interpreting them as the ground of purportedly natural identities, I maintain that this constitution of disabled subjectivities should also be recognized as a strategic mechanism of neoliberalism, that is, as the continuous capacity of a liberal regime to mold the subjectivities of individuals in particular ways for particular purposes. When disability is situated within the domain of force relations, that is, when disability is construed as an apparatus of power rather than as a personal characteristic or attribute, its collaboration with other apparatuses of force relations can be more readily identified and more thoroughly investigated than has been done thus far. Section 5, the final section of my presentation. The fruitfulness of Foucault for a feminist philosophy of disability. My use of Foucault to shape a historicist and relativist feminist philosophy of disability is not without its critics in mainstream philosophy, feminist philosophy, and disability studies, and probably elsewhere. Some of these critics have raised concerns about the status and character of the subject in Foucault's work and whether the absence from his writing of first-person narratives and perspectives limits the appropriateness and effectiveness of his analyses for a feminist philosophy of disability. To take one example, feminist philosopher Chloe Taylor, who has argued that Foucault disregards the subject's materiality and experience of it, claims that the new materialism is therefore better suited to analyses of disability than Foucault's work. To take another example, Jessie Prince, a disabled philosopher of mind, worries that Foucault does not attend to the motives and intentions of the subject. Does Foucault deny the subject and its agency? Does Foucault discount the epistemic value of personal experiences, including experiences of embodiment, experiences such as pain?
Yes.
For years, such concerns and questions have surrounded feminists and other philosophers and theorists of disability who draw on Foucault. Numerous disability studies scholars have been either overtly hostile to Foucault's work or very skeptical about its suitability as a discourse with which to provide an account of disabled people's lives. Even now, some disability studies scholars remain unconvinced about the fruitfulness of Foucault for analyses of disability. The general charges that disability studies scholars have directed at Foucault can be summed up thus. Because Foucault disregards personal experiences, denies the foundational subject and its agency, as well as obscures the body, his work is inappropriate for disability theory and philosophy of disability, both of which ought to attend to the lived experiences and knowledges of disabled people, including their experiences and knowledges of their own embodiment. As I've just now indicated, Taylor and other feminist philosophers have expressed similar concerns about Foucault's work. For instance, some feminist philosophers have argued that insofar as Foucault ignores the insofar as Foucault ignores the material body that historically Eurocentric Western philosophy has associated with women and has subordinated as to an allegedly unencumbered reason associated with men. He extends the subjugation of women in his discourses on power and his history of sexuality especially. I'm going to read that sentence over because I kind of confused and it's a complicated sentence. So here it goes again. For instance, some feminist philosophers have argued that insofar as Foucault ignores the material body that historically Eurocentric Western philosophy has associated with women and hence subordinated to an allegedly unencumbered reason associated with men, he extends the subjugation of women in his discourses on power and his history of sexuality especially. Despite the prevalence of these sorts of criticisms of Foucault in disability theory and in feminist philosophy, the criticisms have never seemed compelling to me. Indeed, I want to emphasize that Foucault did not abandon the subject and its experiences, but rather was concerned to show that the subject and its experiences cannot be dissociated from the historically contingent practices that constitute the subject by and through its experiences. In other words, Foucault did not eliminate the materiality of the body. Rather, Foucault was concerned to show that the body cannot be dissociated from the historically contingent and culturally specific practices that bring it into being. That is, bring it into being as that kind of thing, as impaired, as racialized, as material, as mechanical, as colonized, as gendered, as sexed, and so on. Foucault was also concerned to show that the subject's intentions and motives are byproducts of apparatuses of modern power, which themselves are intentional and non-subjective, that is, are directed at certain aims, but cannot readily be attributed to any particular actors or agents. My argument is that if philosophers of disability were to take up Foucault's approach to power, the constitution of subjects, and neoliberalism, among other things, their analyses of disability could address the neoliberal problematization of disability in philosophy, including the exclusion of disabled philosophers, especially disabled philosophers of disability, that this problematization of disability in philosophy requires. Much of Foucault's work comprises significant attempts to challenge the self-evidence of assumptions about phenomena such as disability by persuasively exposing the historical specificity and contingent character of normality and its cognates, abnormality and pathological. Indeed, Foucault's inquiries into the problematization of abnormality, perversion, and madness were groundbreaking, suggesting a host of innovative avenues of investigation along which future feminist philosophy of disability could proceed. Given the continued reluctance, if not outright refusal, of most analytic philosophers and many feminist philosophers to seriously engage with Foucault's ideas, I wonder, however, if this transformation of philosophy of disability, and indeed philosophy more broadly, will happen sooner or later, and I worry that it may not happen at all. I'd like to sincerely thank you for your attention to my presentation this morning. I look forward to your comments and questions in our discussion. I'd also like to once again thank Melissa Stain and the other conference organizers for inviting me to Disabling Normativities. Lastly, I want to say that you are always welcome to contact me by email or through Biopolitical Philosophy, our philosophy blog. You'll find one of my email addresses on the contributors page of the blog.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, I'm sure you will agree with me that we are up for some treatment in theory, philosophy, knowledge, and thinking. Right, we've got 15 minutes for... Are there any people that cannot hear me? Okay. We've got 15 minutes for... The fourth industrial revolution. We've got 15 minutes for deliberations, questions, comments, and other contributions. Can we show by hand? There's one person there. Is there another mic?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just wanted to find out, especially when we look at the multiple schools of feminisms, where do we position disability-focused philosophy, understanding that disablement is through the social structure, social model of disability? How do we then see a rise, or the possibility for a rise of regionalized disability philosophies? Because disability in the United Kingdom is not the same as disability in the USA or in sub-Saharan Africa. So do you see that sense of scholarship and I don't like the word fraternity because the patriarchy must destruct itself. So grouping of thinkers across different regions. I hope that was clear.
I'm not quite sure I follow, but I'm going to start to answer, and you are welcome to sort of interject and say, well, no, I meant something else. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that, first of all, I should say that I think that feminists have a lot of work to do in terms of incorporating analyses of disability into their own analyses. I mean, you kind of agree with me about that. I think that, so a more integrated approach needs to be taken across a myriad of forms of exclusion and forms of, relations of power. But I think your question is asking me, how do we approach a feminist philosophy of disability when different regions of the world have such different conceptions of disability? Is that...
Different conceptions, different practices of feminism, but also understanding that not everyone leans on the Western canon. So as much as Foucault is a great space for scholarly approach from the Western perspective, if we acknowledge indigenous knowledge and indigenous practices, how then do we bring into philosophies of disability places that don't preface the Western canon as the space to interrogate, to say this could be or this isn't valid?
Okay, I think that Foucault's work is very receptive to indigenous knowledges and non-Western. I don't like the term non-Western, but I'm like knowledges that don't originate from a Eurocentric context. So I think his work is conducive to incorporation or working alongside of other knowledges. But I think that Foucault's work is a tool, and Foucault would have been the first to say, my work is a tool. Take what you can from my work and, put it with other things or, don't use it. I'm not, I draw on Foucault a lot in my work, but I'm not, I don't think that someone who uses Foucault has to, comply with every aspect of his work. I mean, I take what I want from his work, and I'll take what I want from other other philosophies, indigenous philosophies, trans philosophies, whatever. So I think that's a way of making for a kind of feminist philosophy of disability that can be developed in different contexts. Is approaching the material of not thinking of it in terms of you have to subscribe to everything that a particular in a particular way of thinking, but you can sort of take whatever you can use to talk about things the way you want to talk about them. I mean, I take from Foucault what I can use to talk about things the way I want to talk about them, and I use stuff from Black feminist philosophy that will enable me to talk about other things that I want to talk about. So I think it's just a matter of not feeling like you have to subscribe to one particular way of addressing issues. Does that?
Thank you. Let me pick up 3 hands, starting with the colleague at the back there that has the mic, then Sanjay, the colleague there. Any other hands? And more. Then we allow Shelley to respond.
Thank you for such a thought-provoking presentation. I must be honest, I don't know one thing about Foucault.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure where that voice is coming from. I can't tell.
Oh, should I say?
Oh, okay.
I don't know one thing about Foucault, so I think I'm going to put my ignorance on complete display. But
Thank you.
But I'm very interested to know. So I'm very all for embodiment and so on, and finding the balance between biology and social. But for me, I was just wondering when you spoke about Foucault and the body, and that the body is historical and culturally influenced, if I understood that correctly. What would he say, or what would his stance be regarding something like that is completely just a bodily truth? Like for me, who's completely visually impaired, I can't see a sunset, for example. I don't know whether that's historical or cultural, but that's a very, very real experience for me. The fact that I can't see my husband. What would go about that? I'm very curious. Is that a relevant question even?
Any questions relevant?
Sanjay, I think let's take.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Then.
Yeah.
Sanjay.
Okay.
Should I have the mic up?
Can I speak? Shelley, thank you very much for a dense presentation.
Thank you.
Philosophically enriching, but difficult to comprehend for a non-philosopher like me. But I think the philosophy has use when you want to teach or you want to use it in actual practice. So I have 2-3 comments and questions very quickly. How do you respond to the distinction between impairments and disability? Because that distinction assumes importance in actual practice. For example, when you design reasonable accommodation policies, there the individual experiences matters, and there the variability in disability matter. But in your analysis, you are simply straightforwardly you are saying, using Foucault, about whom I have also not read much, to be very honest with you. But you say that disability is merely an apparatus. So basically you are going for social construction model. How this model is first of all different from social model of disability? One, how do you respond to the distinction between impairment and disabilities? How we can then attach importance to the lived experiences and the variabilities in disabilities, because particularly when you want to devise policies for reasonable accommodation to address the individual needs. I mean, bodily differences become important, whether you call a body as historically contingent or socially contingent or culturally contingent, doesn't matter, but body matters. Or are you trying to draw a distinction, I don't know, between flesh and body?
Thank you,
I
Sanjay.
don't know whether I have spoken sense. But
Thank you, Sanjay. The colleague there, and then more.
As a philosopher, Shelley, I thank you for the groundbreaking work that you've done in philosophy and the way in which you've helpfully exposed philosophy here this morning as the construct that it is, the colonial construct. I have a question that might build upon the first questioner's concerns, but my question does remain in the global north. So you use tools that you draw from Foucault, and I think I welcome your putting it in that way. However, in some of your work, you do, I guess, foreground Foucault, and I guess it might be helpful to distinguish between some tools that are found in Foucault and Foucault. Why? Well, I'm attracted to the work of Brady Heiner. Brady Heiner has a paper called Foucault and the Black Panthers, in which he recognizes that Foucault's work on madness in the 60s was groundbreaking, but he advances the claim that Foucault's work on governmentality in the 70s was actually borrowed and borrowed without attribution from his engagement with the Black Panthers, and in fact not really the Black Panthers, specifically George Jackson and Professor Angela Davis. Now I wonder whether if citations are walls, as Professor Sarah Ahmed teaches us, I wonder whether there are ways in which you can continue to be using these tools, but I guess withdraw from associating them completely and exclusively with Foucault, and begin to see how these tools might be drawn from the work, for instance, of George Jackson and Professor Angela Davis.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
More quickly, can we abbreviate our questions so that we can maximize on time?
Thank you for the talk. My question is one on the definitions, because disability, the very definition you'll use is going to have a big impact on, if anything, on your methodology and how you conceive of disability. Because it seems like there's some very important questions regarding my body can affect my understanding of myself and the concept. And it seems that you're trying to move away from a certain definition of disability, but at the same time, you haven't quite stated what that disability is. And I know in which it is important to theorize disability and important to do the work you're doing, but at the same time, there also needs to be almost like a locating it, like which disability. Because some of our disabilities are visible and some of them are invisible. And if we understand disability in that sense, and it's important to be conscious of our disabilities, but also in a sense, and in being conscious, this is where it becomes very important for us to, if anything, come together and work against this specific monster that would make all our disabilities invisible. And it's important to understand which definitions of disability we are using, because those definitions will tell us what exactly is this monster we're fighting. Because you make a very important critique of philosophy, but then I'm not seeing it, the methodology in which you are identifying this type of philosophy to be in. Because now there is a certain type of philosophy which is Eurocentric, which is incapable of seeing the different types of disability and incapable of theorizing the various forms that disability can come in. And therefore, in a sense, our challenging of the academy and philosophy, and not just philosophy, actually, the academy, is that we need to find theories that are able to make complicated. We're not trying to move from one type of disability to another, but rather, how can we have a theory of philosophy that is able to say, I am talking about this philosophy or this philosophy, but at the same time acknowledging that we are fighting the same, in identifying which type of disabilities we are inhabiting, we are actually together fighting the same monster. That is the way the academy and philosophy think about that.
Thank you, Mom. I think you can respond.
You want me to, okay, I'm not sure what the order was here. I think the person at the back,
Sanjay.
Okay, that's right. The colleague at the back. Your question related to the embodiment and the question of whether Foucault denies the body, and I was trying to. Is it? You were concerned about is the fact that you have a particular embodiment. How is that historically and culturally specific? Is that was your question, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was just interested to know how Foucault would understand that experience if he would, like I said, I don't know him at all, so I was just interested how he would frame it or make sense of it, I guess.
Well, I think that we need to think about. You used the examples of that you don't see the sunset, or you don't see. I think the other one was you don't see your husband's face.
Yes.
Okay, and so then we can ask questions about the importance. I mean, we need to, when we talk about, things being historically and culturally specific, I think we need to think about, well, what is that thing in this, in this historical context? So the reason why you brought up the issue of a sunset is because we attribute a certain aesthetic appeal to a sunset, and it has a certain it has a certain significance with respect to beauty, natural beauty, etc. So we can look at those things as historically specific. I mean, 400 years ago, did a sunset have the same kind of significance as it does to us, as it does to people who are located in this historical moment? Did looking at somebody else's face have the significance? Was it given the sort of value that it has in this particular moment? So we have to think about, well, what exactly is the object that we are giving value to? And so it's not just whether one can so we have to, so it's a matter of how big you're going to make the circle of your investigation, what's the scope of your investigation. So if you want to start thinking about in terms of historicism and cultural specificity, let's start looking at the factors involved, and what is their relation to history and their relation to cultural variation. Does that approach an answer to your question?
Yes, thanks. Yes.
Okay. Okay, now Sanjay, you asked a number of questions in your question. So first of all, I think you sort of picked up on that the previous question, and you wanted to know about embodiment. Did I adequately address your question? You also wanted to know about the impairment disability distinction.
Yes.
Okay, well, I actually, the impairment disability distinction is something that I've spent a lot of time on in my writing, and so think in terms of the British social model, the British social model theorists and how they understand the distinction between impairment and disability. They understand it as impairment is something that's natural, it's prediscursive, it's apolitical, and disability is then what is done with that. Okay, so how does society disadvantage or disable people with impairments, as that's the term they use. So would you agree with me about that explanation of the UK social model?
Yeah.
Okay, so in my work, what I do is say that, well, the way that the UK sets up that model is that impairment is basically an inert entity, whereas I think that disability actually produces and is constitutive of impairment. Are you familiar with the work of Judith Butler in gender theory?
A little bit, but not much.
Okay, well, I mean, Butler talks about how gender performances produce the idea of sex, produce the idea that people have a natural sex. Okay, so what I'm doing with the impairment disability distinction is analogous to that. I'm saying that disabling force relations produce the idea that there is a prediscursive impairment. So that's, and you can, the paper in which I introduced that idea is entitled On the Government of Disability. And but you can find it. You can find the arguments in other stuff that I've written. Like, for instance, you told me last night, I think, that you have Foucault and the Government of Disability, the collection.
Yeah.
Okay. In the introduction to that collection, I expand on that argument. So if you want to look at that introduction again.
Definitely.
Okay.
Right.
I think I'm not quite sure who was next.
The colleague here. Right? Yeah.
Oh, Nathaniel. Okay, Nathaniel. Nathaniel. I'm going to try to reiterate what you said. So you were you first were wondering about. You acknowledged my use of. My idea that Foucault has provided us with tools and that I'm using these tools, and you thought that was a good idea, but you seem to be suggesting that I should move away from so much reliance on Foucault, and that I should think in terms just of using the tools. Is that, if that's what your point was, I would agree, and I'm trying to do that. And I think part of the reason why Foucault is still sort of, well, for one thing, I don't know if you have noted, I don't know if you've been following the blog recently, or one thing I've been trying to do is raise the awareness of the fact that, because in philosophy, when Foucault is talked about, he's talked about as a male philosopher. He's not talked about as a disabled philosopher. He's not talked about as a gay male philosopher. So I've been trying to I think one of the reasons why I'm still sort of, using him a lot is because I'm trying more and more to bring out the fact that he was disabled and that he was also, so here he was, this disabled gay male philosopher. Here's all this talk in philosophy now about, raising the representation of, queer philosophers and well, here's this disabled philosopher that's still getting marginalized, and so I'm trying to sort of bring that more into the fore. But I do think that I take your point that one could that it's good to move away to sort of be using tools without necessarily using the tool maker.
But also, I agree with that point, definitely. But also,
Can you wait for the mic?
Yes,
Okay.
So yes, I very much welcome thinking through Foucault as a person who's disabled by society. But also I'd invite you to think about Foucault as someone who is possibly not the tool maker.
I was actually going to address that next. Okay, so I'm not sure. I know that I read a paper about Foucault and the Black Panthers. I'm not sure that it's the one that you were referring to. That doesn't sound as familiar as I think it would if I had read it. But I mean, it's certainly that's certainly not something I had heard before or read before. But it's something that I think it should even be addressed, explicitly in some kind of writing or something. So if I could get that citation from you, I'd appreciate it. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So I think there was one.
What was the last one?
Okay. I'm not sure that I felt. I'm not sure that I. Okay. Oh, I know that. You seem. There seems to be a disagreement. I think that the main point of your comment was that you are disagreeing with me about the way in which I am saying that distinctions between types of disabilities are, that to me, I think of that as in terms of, I want people to start thinking of that in terms of as a strategy and mechanism of neoliberalism, and you're saying, well, no, that's important to hang on to. Is that?
Let's just say oh, sorry. Let me get the mic. Let's say it's a question of methodology, because the very concepts we use are based on a certain understanding or a certain theory or a methodology that we use. So now, I'm trying to make sense of your methodology, because right now it's not clear which disability you're referring to. So right now it's like there's a lumping of it. And so that lumping, I'm stressing, comes from your methodology being, it's in critique of a certain type of understanding of what disability is, but in that understanding of what disability is, it takes on that very same notion of what disability that it is trying to critique. So it seems like you're critiquing an understanding from philosophy that wants to limit or restrict or make invisible this definition of disability. And so you're saying that, okay, moving away from that kind of methodology and saying disability needs to be understood in this and this and this way. And I'm saying, but in doing so, you've also it hasn't been a clear description of what you mean by disability. And in doing so, that lack of clarity then it opens up holes in which one now is challenged to deal with the fact that disability comes in various forms, and therefore you have to, if anything, be very clear in terms of your methodology, what it is that you are arguing against, which specific element of understanding of disability you're arguing against. But in particular, like actually engage with the fact that how can we come up with a theory that both is able to deal with the particularities that have been the particularities of what it means to be disabled, but at the same time, how can we have a definition of disability that allows all of us who are both living with disabilities, but at the same time both identify as disabled, able to come together and if anything, come together in our activism. And particularly that coming together in the activism is what in my argument can be done, but it has to be done in which you need to be clear on exactly what your monster is that you're fighting. Is it gender? Is it race? And if it is all of these things, it needs to be made clear. What is it all about the philosophies, about academia? What is that train of thinking? What is that thinking based on? It's a very...
Okay,
Sorry, I'm just trying to rephrase that it's approach and method. Her question means it's like what's your approach and method.
Okay. First of all, I disagree with almost everything you said. First of all, I want to clarify that philosophers are not talking about disability in the way that I do. That's one thing that I wanted to bring out in my presentation. Philosophers will make the kind of distinctions between types of disability, and I'm saying that we need to move away from that. So it's kind of hard to see because of your head's in the way, Melissa. Thank you. So I'm saying that disability. You said, well, it's not clear what kind of disability I'm talking about. I'm trying to move disability away from talking about it in terms of types. Disability is not, on my view, disability is not a property of a person. People don't have disabilities, okay? Disability is a structure. Disability is a thing. People are disabled. It's an event. It's an event. People are disabled. People are racialized. People are gendered. So it's something that's done to people. People don't have sexes. They're sexed. Okay. So I'm trying to move away from the idea, and I do think that I argue in my book and elsewhere in this presentation that the kinds of distinctions that are taken to be important with respect to, like, people think it's important to see all different kinds of disabilities and to make all kinds of distinctions. I think that's a trap. I think that is a trap of neoliberalism. I think that's a trap of medicalization of our bodies. And so I'm saying we need to stop making these distinctions. We need to think in terms of people being disabled, and think in terms of these in the 2001 paper that I mentioned to Sanjay on the government of disability. I at the very end of the paper, I listed a number of distinctions that are made between ADHD, hyperactivity disorder, etc. And my point is to say that these ways of thinking, and one of your concerns seems to be, well, how can we form coalitions? How can we do something together? I think that